Would you please pray with me? Gracious and loving Spirit, fill our minds with your word and help us to be curious. Increase our love for one another and inspire us with a commitment to create a transformed world, starting with ourselves. Amen. Well, today I'm beginning a 3-week series. A series that I am calling Crossing Over. And there's a lot of traveling around that Jesus does in the next 3 weeks in the scriptures that we'll read. He travels across a lake or part of the lake. He goes up north and toward the Mediterranean Sea, and then he travels inland again. This week, Jesus and the disciples cross over the northern part of the Sea of Galilee, Tiberias, a distance of a few miles. They do this overnight, so they're also crossing over from one day to another. Next week, we'll read about the Canaanite woman who meets Jesus at the edge of the Mediterranean Sea in a region called Tyre and Sidon. It's about 40 to 50 miles away from Sea of Galilee. And on August 23rd, we'll follow Jesus and the disciples as they move inland, eastward, about 30 to 40 miles, to the base of the highest peak in the region, Mount Hermon. In addition to the physical distance they cover, there's also a spiritual crossing over that happens as they move from place to place. We are in a kind of a crossing over time as we move into the second half of summer, and with our fall startup, unbelievably, if you can believe it, just a little more than a month away, we're crossing over too. And so, what can we discover during this time? Well, have you ever woken up in the middle of the night? And by middle of the night, I mean 3 a.m. in the morning. Maybe you were worried about some event coming up. And maybe you couldn't wait to begin celebrating your 9th birthday. Maybe you were planning something, maybe a trip. Maybe you were rearranging the living room furniture in your mind. Or maybe you were working on a project at work. You tried to go back to sleep, but sleep just wouldn't come. After tossing and turning, you looked over to the clock. 4:29. Knowing you've been awake for an hour and a half made you even more anxious. And if that's ever happened to you, then you were sleepless in Portland, or Poughkeepsie, or Pensacola, in the 4th watch of the night, 3 a.m. to 6 a.m. The 4th watch is mentioned at several points in Scripture. The Israelites were finally released from slavery in Egypt, and they had come to the edge of the sea in their escape. With Pharaoh's army in hot pursuit, God opened up the sea so the Israelites could walk through on dry ground. You know the story. And God held back their pursuers, at least for a time. But then, in the morning watch, the 4th watch of the night, God allowed Pharaoh to continue the pursuit. You can read what else happened in Exodus 14. I'll let you stew over that one. Many centuries later, a Jewish rabbi rose to pray by himself very early in the morning while it was still dark and presumably very quiet. A few years later, 3 days after that same rabbi was put to death on a cross, 2 women, both named Mary, visited his tomb at dawn at the end of the 4th watch. Rather than finding battle-ready Roman guards in front of a sealed tomb, the women saw the guards, but they looked like dead men having died of fright. And they were guarding, if you can call it that, nothing but an empty tomb. As they were growing up, my children would hear me tell them to be home by midnight because, as I said, nothing good happens after midnight. They held to that midnight deadline pretty well, though some There were a few nail-biting experiences. I remember when I stayed out into the wee hours of the night once in high school. I started playing a board game at a friend's house, my friend Rex, at about 10 p.m. So I wasn't doing anything too risky. As it turns out, however, we were playing the game called Risk. No, I'm not lying. That is truly what we were playing. And if any of you know the game, you know that it can go on for quite some time. Well, this one went on for 6 hours. And after playing for a while, I looked up at the clock, 1 a.m. I thought about calling my parents to let them know where I was. We didn't have cell phones back then, but we did have phones. I didn't do that, however. Now, in my defense, the reason was because I didn't want to wake them up. Oh, the teenage mind. So I kept playing, and when the game was over, I drove home. I walked in the front door at 4 a.m., the fourth watch of the night, middle of the fourth watch of the night. And guess who was wide awake and ready to greet me right there at the door? Lesson learned. When in doubt, always call home. First the test, and then the lesson. Usually it's the other way around. You know, I spent many years in education. Unfortunately for students, tests are just a fact of life. And most of the time, the lessons do go before the test. I don't know too many people who like tests, although I did have a few interesting students who said they did like to be tested. I don't know, maybe. But on the whole, tests generally aren't all that popular among students. I never asked my students if they wanted to be tested. I simply expected them to take the test. Some did well, some didn't do so well. Now, typically, a student who didn't do well could take a similar test if they wanted to. Those who got a C or a D or perhaps failed the test would often ask, usually the C's or the D's would ask, if we do worse the second time, will you keep the better grade? As if it's the grade that really matters. But I get it. I was a student too. The disciples had probably been with Jesus for a couple of years by the time they climbed into a boat to take what turned out to be something like a test, perhaps in the second watch of the night. They had heard a lot of lessons to that point. I read a commentary some time ago. The source is lost to me now, but I wrote the dates in the pages of my Bible that suggested that in Matthew's timeline, Jesus' baptism took place in the fall of the year 26, the beginning of his public ministry, and that Jesus' appearance to his disciples on the water happened 3 years later in the summer of 29. That time on the boat, though, wasn't the first time they were tested, and perhaps it was a test. A year earlier, Jesus had sent the disciples out with authority to drive out unclean spirits and to heal every disease and sickness. It was sort of a test, although their success was pretty much guaranteed. This business in the boat on a tormented sea, in the fourth watch of the night, was the first real test of what they had learned, the first recorded opportunity in Matthew that gives us a glimpse as to whether or not they were really understanding what Jesus was teaching them about over the years. Like so many teachers who slap down tests on the desks of their students on test day, Jesus did not ask the disciples if they wanted to be tested. He didn't ask if they wanted to get into the boat. Jesus insisted that the disciples got in. That Greek word for insisted is often translated as made, as in Jesus made them get into the boat. But I like the inclusive language version for a variety of reasons, but I like this one in particular because it really does put a fine point on that word, that Greek word that means insisted. I think it retains the original meaning. Jesus compelled and even forced the disciples to get into the boat. He wasn't asking, would you like to get into the boat? You'll get into the boat. They may not have known that a test was coming, and perhaps Jesus liked pop quizzes. But Matthew's gospel makes it clear that they did not have a choice. And they may have thought that they were sitting down to engage in a nice required task, but it turned out that they were about to play a game of Risk for the next several hours, culminating in the fourth watch. The task itself wasn't the important thing. Jesus wouldn't give them a grade, and no one would be declared the winner. The important part of this test was to demonstrate, mostly to themselves, what they had learned. And I wonder what they did learn. Matthew may offer some clues about what Jesus hoped they would learn, what everyone in this who reads this passage could possibly learn. Perhaps the reader or the disciples would identify with Peter in this story and keep their eyes on Jesus, come what may. Perhaps they would take from this brief story the words of Jesus walking on the water during the dark night of the soul, and hear his words, "It's me. Don't be afraid." Maybe the reader would see themselves and the disciples after Jesus returned to the boat, after the wind died down, when they showed great reverence to God's own. Whatever the lesson is that they learned, it wasn't the test itself that mattered. The test during the fourth watch. The test came, but hopefully the disciples didn't focus on that. The lesson was everything. You know, in the aftermath of our house fire, we relied on all kinds of help from people that we know and we don't know. Friends, strangers, our insurance company, and they've been good to us. As we've moved to various temporary housing situations, we've had every cleanable object removed from the house, sorted through every other object, and decided, should we keep this or should we throw this away? Worked with the remediation company to start the cleanup process. And I'm not sure that I've learned this lesson, but I'm trying to learn that all will be well. I don't mean to sound like some high-minded guru. I'm not. I'm just bumbling along with the disciples, trying not to focus on the grade, on the test itself, but rather on the important lessons to be learned. Because if I focus on the test, then I'll probably live in the past and probably dwell on what I did wrong and maybe get caught in a swirling eddy of emotions that go with failure, anger or depression or sadness or fear. If I focus on the test, all the stress and the storminess in the fourth watch of the night, then I might correct my mistakes if I'm ever in the very same situation again. But when does that ever happen? Better to focus on what I've learned, the broader lesson that I can apply to my life in the future, and to focus on what I can do right. So what are the lessons that you have learned that have most shaped who you are? The lessons that continue to live in your body, that have changed how you move through the world. Was there a test involved? Either before or after? Did the test happen in the middle of the day? When you could see well? When you were fully awake? maybe felt in control? Or were these lessons born of hardship and difficulty as you made your way through the darkness, when you felt least awake in the metaphorical fourth watch? Did you feel ready for the test? I suspect that the majority of people would say that the most important life lessons came to them in the fourth watch, unbidden and unwelcome, and that given the choice, they would have opted out of the test. Now, I suppose we could get angry at our lack of options, at the one who forces us into the boat while storm clouds build on the horizon. Many have. I don't blame them. A God who puts us in harm's way on purpose in hopes that we'll gain some bigger life lesson isn't a loving God for some. Now, some come to the alternate conclusion that it's not God who creates the tests. Tests just happen, and God is there. But God is like a parent who chooses not to protect their children in every circumstance so that they will hopefully learn and gain wisdom and understanding. Either way, it's tempting to focus on the test itself rather than what we can learn in the fourth watch of the night. Now, I confess to you right now, as God is my witness, that I'm still stuck in the fourth watch in certain areas of my life. I dwell too much on the struggle and the injustice of things that have happened in the past rather than demonstrating to God, but mostly to myself, what I have learned. Tests come and go. What we learn stays with us forever. If the disciples learned to keep their eyes on Jesus, or not to be afraid, or to rely on Jesus to save them, they did not learn it through book study. They did not learn through lectures or parables, through watching miracles, or through sermons. They learned because Jesus compelled them to get into the boat, sent them into a storm, let them struggle through the night, revealed himself as the I am, and trusted that God's work in them would bring the fourth watch of the night into the coming day, into the life beyond sorrow and pain. And to know that in the midst of that pain, in the words of the 14th century English mystic Julian of Norwich, all will be well, and all will be well, and all manner of thing will be well.